This isn't some minor legal footnote either. This comparison is now officially part of Harry's court arguments, and it's forcing Ravek, that's the committee that decides who gets security, to defend a position that looks increasingly indefensible, and the timing couldn't be more calculated. With Andrew's name constantly resurfacing in connection with the Epstein files, with King Charles's health uncertain, with the family allegedly trying to reconcile before it's too late, Harry's team has chosen this exact moment to make the comparison impossible to ignore. Think about what this means. For years, Harry's been told his security was removed because he's not a working royal anymore. Case closed. But Andrew's not a working royal either, hasn't been since 2019, and his security never went anywhere. So either the working royal standard is applied selectively, or there's a different set of rules that nobody wants to admit exists. Harry's forcing that admission. Let me walk you through why this strategy might actually work, why it's got the palace scrambling, and what it tells us about how the monarchy really operates behind all the formal procedures and official denials. Let me walk you through why this strategy might actually work, why it's got the palace scrambling, and what it tells us about how the monarchy really operates behind all the formal procedures and official denials. Okay, so first things first. We need to understand what Ravek is and why this whole security thing became Harry's biggest battle. Ravek stands for the Royal and VIP Executive Committee, and they're the ones who decide which public figures in Britain get taxpayer-funded police protection. It's a committee made up of senior people from the Home Office, Metropolitan Police, and here's where it gets interesting. Representatives from the royal household itself. That last part matters because Harry's been saying from the beginning that the palace has influence over these security decisions, and the official response has always been that Ravek operates independently, except recent reporting has started to contradict that. Sources have admitted that palace intervention could prevent approval of Harry's security, which is a pretty big admission after years of saying they have no involvement whatsoever. And here's something that adds fuel to Harry's suspicions. Sir Clive Alderton, who's King Charles's current private secretary and one of his closest advisors, actually sits on Ravek. So when the palace says they have no power over security decisions, but the king's right-hand man is literally on the committee making those decisions, you can see why Harry's team is skeptical. Royal aides recently tried to push back on suggestions that the palace could intervene, calling it unjust and inaccurate. But then they added this interesting qualifier. While palace representatives sit on the committee, their role isn't to advise on threat analysis or mitigations. Okay, but they're still voting members of the committee that makes final decisions. That's influence, whether you want to call it that or not. When Harry and Meghan stepped back in early 2020, Ravek decided Harry would lose automatic police protection. Instead, he'd get security on a case-by-case basis, meaning he'd have to request it for each visit, and they'd decide whether to approve it. The official reasoning was that his status had changed. He wasn't a working royal anymore, so he didn't meet the criteria for automatic protection. But here's the thing that's been bothering Harry's legal team since day one. Ravek made this decision without conducting a proper risk assessment. Their own rules, written down in 2017, say they're supposed to have their risk management board do a formal threat analysis before making security decisions. They skipped that step entirely for Harry. The last real assessment done on him was back in April 2019, when he was still a full-time working royal. That assessment placed him in the highest threat category possible, the same level as Queen Elizabeth. We're talking about someone who served 2 combat tours in Afghanistan, who's been targeted by extremist groups, who has global name recognition. The factors that made him high risk in 2019 didn't vanish in 2020 just because his job title changed. And look, this isn't abstract. Harry's military service alone makes him a target. He flew Apache helicopters in Afghanistan and was open about his role in combat operations. He talked about it publicly in interviews. That kind of visibility in a war zone doesn't just create temporary risk, it creates enemies who have long memories. Neo-Nazi groups have specifically mentioned him in their communications. These are documented threats, not hypotheticals. Then you add in the stalking incidents, the paparazzi chases, the harassment that follows him and Meghan everywhere they go. In September 2025, there were those 2 encounters where a woman got dangerously close to him at public events. The first time, she approached him before anyone could react. The second time, Only his private security guard stopping her prevented another incident. That's not theoretical danger. That's someone with fixation on him, actively trying to get close enough to do harm. Harry's been fighting this decision through the courts ever since, and up until recently, he kept losing. In May 2025, he lost a major appeal. The judges said Ravek acted within their discretionary authority, that the case-by-case approach was reasonable, and that Harry's grievances didn't amount to a legal argument. Pretty harsh. But then something shifted. In December 2025, instead of filing another appeal, Harry wrote directly to the Home Secretary requesting a full security risk assessment. And surprisingly, Ravek agreed to do one. For the first time since 2020, they initiated a comprehensive review. Why would they suddenly agree to this after years of refusing? Two big reasons. First, the procedural gap was becoming harder to defend. Even though courts said Ravek had authority to decide, the fact they'd never conducted an updated formal assessment looked increasingly problematic. When you're the government and you're skipping your own procedures, that creates vulnerability. It gives people grounds to argue you're not operating fairly or consistently. And Harry's lawyers had been hammering on this point for years, not that the decision was wrong, but that the process was flawed. Second, and this is crucial, there were documented incidents in 2025 that changed the equation. Those September stalking encounters weren't just scary moments. They were proof that Harry faces real, ongoing threats when he's in Britain. His private security managed to handle those situations, but they're operating without intelligence networks, without coordination with local police, without advanced warning systems. They're reactive, not proactive, and security experts will tell you that's not sustainable for someone with Harry's threat profile. In September 2025, a woman got dangerously close to Harry at a public event in Britain. Close enough that if she'd had malicious intent, his private security team wouldn't have stopped her in time. Days later, the same woman tried to approach him again and was only prevented by a private guard who recognized her. These were real stalking incidents that security professionals could point to as evidence the threat hadn't disappeared. So Ravek opened a review, and by January 2026, sources were saying the decision was basically made. Insiders called it a formality, said Harry met the threshold for protection, used phrases like nailed on, which brings us to now, to February 2026, and to the Uncle Andrew strategy. Prince Andrew's situation is where this gets really uncomfortable for the palace and for Ravek. Let me lay out exactly what happened with him, because the timeline matters. In November 2019, Andrew did that disastrous BBC interview with Emily Maitlis, where he tried to explain his friendship with Jeffrey Epstein and address allegations from Virginia Giuffre. She'd accused him of sexually abusing her when she was 17 at locations including Ghislaine Maxwell's London home and Epstein's properties. Andrew's defenses, claiming he was at Pizza Express in Woking, saying he couldn't sweat due to a Falklands War condition, didn't exactly help his case. Within days of that interview, Andrew announced he was stepping back from royal duties. Not temporarily. For the foreseeable future, which everyone understood meant permanently. Then in 2021, Giuffre filed a civil lawsuit against him in New York. Andrew eventually settled in February 2022 for a reported sum somewhere between $12 and $16 million when you include legal costs. No admission of guilt, but he paid, and the Queen or Charles likely helped fund that settlement because Andrew didn't have that kind of money. After settling, Andrew was stripped of his military titles and royal patronages. He couldn't use his HRH style publicly anymore. He became persona non grata at major royal events. Even his own mother kept him at arm's length in public. Polling showed him as the most unpopular royal family member with an 88% negative rating. And through all of this, the scandal, the settlement, the disgrace, the Epstein files being released, renewed calls for him to testify before US authorities. Prince Andrew kept his taxpayer-funded security, round-the-clock police protection, a personal protection officer whenever he leaves home, permanent security arrangements at his Windsor property, all paid for by British taxpayers at an estimated annual cost between £500,000 and £3 million. The Telegraph reported in August 2022 that Ravek had actually conducted a full review of Andrew's security entitlement, the kind of proper assessment they never did for Harry, and concluded he was still entitled to police bodyguards despite everything. So here's Harry's legal team's argument, and it's devastating in its logic. What is the actual standard for who gets protection? It can't be based on being a working royal, because Andrew isn't working either. It can't be based on scandal or reputational damage, because Andrew has that in abundance. It can't be based on HRH status, because Andrew gave that up publicly. It can't be based on public opinion, because Andrew is massively unpopular. The only explanation that fits the facts is that born royals, people who inherit their position by blood, get protection regardless of scandal or working status, while Harry, who's also a born royal, somehow doesn't. That's the double standard Harry's team is forcing Ravek and the courts to address. And here's why this argument is so powerful from a legal standpoint. Courts might not want to second-guess Ravek's discretionary decisions about security, but they absolutely will step in if those decisions appear arbitrary or discriminatory. If you're treating two people in similar circumstances completely differently without a rational explanation, that's a problem. That's the kind of procedural unfairness that courts do intervene on. Harry's not asking the court to say he deserves security more than Andrew. He's asking them to say that if Andrew qualifies despite everything, then Harry must qualify too because he faces equal or greater risk with fewer negatives. It's not about forcing Ravek to make a specific decision, it's about forcing them to apply their standards consistently. And consistency is something courts care deeply about. Harry actually wrote about this comparison in his memoir Spare. He talked about how when he and Meghan decided to step back, their publicly funded protection was swiftly removed. But Andrew, despite being involved in what Harry called an embarrassing scandal and being accused of sexually abusing a young woman, never had his security suggested for removal. Harry's point was blunt. People might have grievances with him and Meghan, but sexual offences weren't among them. That passage from Spare has been resurfacing constantly, especially with ongoing Epstein revelations. Every time Andrew's name hits the news cycle, and it hits frequently, it reinforces Harry's argument about unfairness. The timing actually works in Harry's favor. The more people are reminded of Andrew's scandals, the harder it becomes to justify why he has protection and Harry doesn't. The palace is in an impossible position, trying to defend this. How do you explain to British taxpayers and to the courts that the disgraced prince embroiled in a sex abuse scandal deserves protection, but the prince who just wanted to leave doesn't? You can't really. Not without admitting there's a hierarchy based on birth order or palace favor rather than actual threat assessment. The official line has always been that Ravek operates independently based on intelligence-led threat assessments. But if that were truly the case, how does Andrew's security survive his scandals while Harry's disappears the moment his job changes? The answer increasingly looks like discretion isn't being applied neutrally. It's being applied in a way that protects certain royals regardless of circumstances while punishing others for stepping away. Recent reporting has started to crack the facade of Ravek's independence. Sources have acknowledged that palace intervention could still prevent approval of Harry's security. That's a huge admission after years of categorical denials. If the palace has no power over Ravek decisions, why would their intervention matter? The fact that people are even discussing palace involvement as a possibility shows the independence claim was always overstated. There's also fascinating backstory about palace personnel that connects to Harry's suspicions. Back in July 2017, just months before Harry proposed to Meghan, there was a major shake-up. Lord Christopher Geidt, the Queen's private secretary, who was respected for wanting to modernize the monarchy, got pushed out. Who orchestrated it? Prince Charles, his private secretary Sir Clive Alderton, and Prince Andrew. They wanted Sir Edward Young in the role instead. Princess Anne and Prince Edward reportedly thought removing Geidt was one of the worst mistakes of the Queen's later years. Geidt was former military intelligence, knew how to handle difficult personalities, and people believed he would have smoothly integrated Meghan into the royal family. Instead, by November 2017, Sir Edward Young wasn't just the Queen's private secretary. He was also part of the royal household involved in determining security through Ravek. So from Harry's perspective, the people making security decisions were the same people who just orchestrated a palace power play. When his security got stripped in February 2020, while he was still technically a working royal until the end of March, he had reason to believe palace politics played a role. And the fact that Sir Clive Alderton, who was instrumental in pushing out Geet, is now on Rorvec as Charles's private secretary, that's got to make Harry wonder whether independent assessment or palace preference is driving these decisions. This historical context matters because it shows there's precedent for palace courtiers influencing major decisions in ways that affect Harry's life. The Guide removal happened right when Harry was getting serious with Meghan. Then security decisions that directly impact Harry's safety are made by a committee that includes the same palace officials. It's not paranoia to connect those dots, it's pattern recognition. The contrast with Andrew's treatment is stark. Andrew stepped back from duties in November 2019. His security was never formally revoked. He got a proper RAVVEC review that confirmed his entitlement. Meanwhile, Harry got notified his protection was being removed before he'd even officially left, and without any updated risk assessment. Here's where the Uncle Andrew defense gets even more powerful. It's not just about the unfairness, it's about forcing RAVVEC to articulate a coherent standard. If they say working status determines protection, Harry points to Andrew. If they say scandal disqualifies you, Harry points to Andrew. If they say birth into the royal family creates inherent risk that justifies protection, well, Harry was born into that same family. The argument essentially corners RAVVEC into admitting either that their decisions are arbitrary and inconsistent, or that there's an unspoken policy of treating born royals differently based on factors other than genuine security concerns. Neither admission looks good in court or in public opinion. Social media reaction has been brutal for the palace. Andrew and Harry have been trending together for days. Even people who aren't particularly sympathetic to Harry are struggling to justify the disparity. The common response is, however you feel about Harry's choices, he hasn't been accused of crimes, he served his country in combat, and he faces documented threats. How does he not qualify for protection when Andrew does? The Twitter threads have been absolutely scathing. People are pulling up old articles about Andrew's security costs, comparing them to Harry being denied the ability to even pay for his own police protection. Screenshots of Andrew's settlement amount versus Harry's military service record, timelines showing when each prince lost their working royal status versus when their security was affected. The visual evidence of the double standard is overwhelming when you lay it all out. And it's not just Harry supporters making these arguments. Royal commentators who've been critical of the Sussexes are struggling to defend the Andrew comparison. Even staunch monarchists are having trouble explaining how you protect one disgraced prince but not another, who simply chose to leave. The cognitive dissonance is too obvious to ignore. What's interesting is how this has shifted the conversation from whether Harry deserves security to why Andrew still has his. That's clever framing from Harry's team. Instead of having to justify his own need for protection, he's forcing others to justify Andrew's continued access to it. Offense instead of defense. And in the court of public opinion, Andrew is indefensible. Every attempt to explain why he needs protection just highlights how much more Harry would need it by any reasonable standard. The ethical debate is uncomfortable for everyone. Should taxpayers fund security for any non-working royals? That's a legitimate question. But if the answer is no, it has to apply consistently. You can't say no to Harry while saying yes to Andrew without exposing yourself to charges of favoritism or political influence. And this gets at a deeper question about the social contract between the monarchy and the people it creates. The royal family isn't like other families. You can't just leave and become a private citizen because the factors that make you a target, your birth, your upbringing, your global recognition, don't disappear when you resign from royal duties. The institution benefited from Harry for 20 years, used his image, his service, his popularity to enhance the monarchy's standing. And now they're trying to say, okay, you're on your own, good luck with the death threats. That feels fundamentally unfair to a lot of people, even those who aren't particularly sympathetic to Harry's other choices. You can think he shouldn't have done the Oprah interview or written Spare and still believe he deserves protection from credible threats. Those aren't mutually exclusive positions. There's also the practical reality that private security, no matter how well funded, can't replicate what taxpayer-funded police protection provides. Private guards don't have access to intelligence databases. They can't coordinate seamlessly with local police forces. They don't get advance warnings about potential threats from MI5 or counter-terrorism units. They're always playing catch-up, reacting to situations as they develop instead of preventing them before they happen. Harry offered to pay for police protection himself. He was told no, that's not how it works. The government's position was that police shouldn't be available as private bodyguards for the wealthy, which sounds principled until you remember they're providing police protection to Andrew using taxpayer money, despite him being neither wealthy nor employed in royal service. So it's not really about principle, it's about selective application of standards. There's also the bigger question of what we owe people thrust into public life without choosing it. Harry didn't volunteer to be born fifth in line to the throne. The visibility, scrutiny, and danger that came with that were involuntary. He served 20 years as a working royal, did military service, represented Britain internationally. So at what point does the institution that created him and benefited from his service get to wash its hands of responsibility for the consequences? The slimmed-down monarchy concept Charles has been pushing creates this exact problem. You produce an entire generation of royals to support the institution, William and Harry, their cousins, now their children, but then say you don't need their labor anymore. Yet you can't undo their existence or their public profiles. They're still targets. They still face risks stemming from royal birth. So what's the plan? If Harry's Uncle Andrew defense succeeds, it could set precedent that fundamentally changes how royal security works going forward. It would establish that birth into the royal family creates a baseline entitlement to protection that shouldn't be stripped away based solely on working status or palace favor. That would be a significant shift. The timing of Ravek's review decision is interesting too. It's expected before the end of January 2026, which means we should know any day now. If they reinstate Harry's security, it's a massive vindication of his 5-year legal battle and potentially opens the door to family reconciliation. His children could finally visit Britain safely and meet their grandfather King Charles. If Ravek denies him or offers some watered-down compromise, Harry has the Uncle Andrew comparison loaded and ready to deploy in the next round of legal challenges. The comparison is now officially part of his legal strategy, which means courts will have to address it directly. They can't just dismiss it as Harry's grievance anymore. Charles's health adds urgency to the situation. He's been undergoing cancer treatment, though he said it moved into a precautionary phase. There are whispers the situation might be more serious than publicly acknowledged. Royal expert Ian Pelham-Turner suggested the timing of the security review might be connected to concerns about Charles's health, potentially clearing things up before more decisive arrangements need to be made. Harry reunited briefly with his father in September 2025 for the first time in 19 months. They had afternoon tea at Clarence House. Harry described his father as great and said they're in regular contact now, but he's also stated publicly that Charles won't talk to him about the security issue, that it's become this wedge between them. Getting security resolved could remove that barrier to fuller reconciliation. For William, this could actually be helpful too, despite any personal tensions with Harry. A brother permanently excluded from Britain on security grounds isn't a sustainable optic for a future king trying to position himself as a unifier. Whatever William's private feelings are, and reports suggest they're pretty frosty, having Harry indefinitely locked out creates an ongoing PR problem that resolution would fix. The legal costs on all of Harry's court cases are mounting to staggering levels. The Daily Mail phone hacking case alone is estimated around £40 million. Add in years of security litigation, and it's an enormous financial and emotional investment. Harry clearly believes it's worth it, not just for himself, but to force systemic change in how the press and the government treat members of the royal family. His testimony in the Daily Mail trial in late January 2026 was emotional. He nearly cried on the stand, talking about how the legal battles have made his wife's life absolute misery. He invoked his mother Diana, who died fleeing paparazzi. The trauma from that clearly drives his determination to protect his own family differently. What strikes me about this whole situation is how it exposes the contradictions at the heart of the modern monarchy. They want the benefits of tradition and hereditary privilege, the pageantry, the continuity, the special status, but they don't want the responsibilities that come with creating public figures who can't escape their royal identity even if they step away from royal duty. Harry was produced by this system, raised in it, molded by it, used by it for 20 years of service, and now the system wants to pretend he can just be a private citizen when the very factors that make him high risk, his birth, his military service, his global recognition, his association with the monarchy, all stem from that system. That's the fundamental unfairness Harry's trying to expose. The Uncle Andrew comparison makes it impossible to ignore that contradiction. If Andrew, despite everything, still gets protection because he was born into the family, then being born into the family must create an enduring claim to protection that transcends working status or scandal. Apply that logic consistently, and Harry qualifies. Refuse to apply it consistently, and you're admitting the system is arbitrary and unfair. Ravik is backed into a corner. The procedural failures are documented. The double standard with Andrew is indefensible. The documented threats against Harry are real. The political calculus increasingly favors giving Harry what he's asked for all along. Continuing to deny him while protecting Andrew creates more problems than it solves. So here's what I think happens. Ravik confirms Harry meets the threshold for protection and reinstates his security. They frame it as following proper procedures and responding to updated threat assessments rather than admitting they were wrong all along. Harry gets his vindication without them having to explicitly acknowledge the Andrew comparison forced their hand. That outcome lets everyone save some face while resolving a situation that's become untenable. Harry gets to bring his family to Britain safely. Charles gets a chance at reconciliation before his health potentially worsens. William gets his brother back in the country without security being the excuse keeping him away. And Ravik avoids having courts rule explicitly on whether their treatment of Harry versus Andrew was unfairly discriminatory. But if I'm wrong and they deny him again, Harry's legal team has the ammunition loaded. The Uncle Andrew defense will be the centerpiece of whatever comes next, and courts will finally have to rule directly on whether the double standard is legally defensible. That's a fight the palace and Ravik really don't want, because there's no good way to justify the disparity. This is about more than just security. It's about whether the monarchy can evolve to deal humanely with the people it creates. It's about whether institutions are accountable when their decisions appear arbitrary or influenced by personal politics rather than genuine risk assessment. It's about whether someone born into a system they didn't choose has any claim to protection from the consequences of that birth when they decide to leave. Drop your thoughts below. Do you think the Andrew comparison is fair? Should taxpayers fund security for any non-working royals? Is there a legitimate double standard here, or are these genuinely different situations? Hit that like button if this breakdown helped you understand what's really going on. Subscribe because this story isn't over, and major developments are coming soon. And let me know what other royal family deep dives you want to see, because there's always more drama brewing. The Uncle Andrew defense might go down as the strategic move that finally won Harry the battle he's been fighting for 5 years. We're about to find out.